The mind is a battlefield, and often our greatest opponent is ourselves. What if the loudest voice in our hearts is the very one that leads us away from our true strength? It was one of those serene nights by the Sea of Galilee, the kind of evening that seemed to still the chaos of the world, if only for a moment. The gentle rustle of the wind through the olive trees, the faint murmurs of distant waves, and the dim glow of stars created an almost sacred atmosphere. Yet, amid this external peace, the disciples of Jesus were troubled. Around a small fire, Peter, John, James, Matthew, Thomas, and the others sat, quiet and uneasy. Despite the miracles they had witnessed, the compassion and love they had experienced through Jesus, there was an inner storm raging in each of them. It was not the kind of storm that was visible to the eye, but one that brewed in their minds, a storm of doubt, fear, and insecurity. 4 days now, Peter had wrestled with his thoughts. He had seen Jesus calm the winds and waves, but the winds inside him remained untamed. His boldness and strength, once a source of pride, had begun to waver. He couldn't silence the voice within him that constantly whispered, "You're going to fail. You're not worthy of him." Peter's mind returned to the moment when he had stepped out onto the water at Jesus' call. For a few miraculous seconds, he had walked on the sea, feeling invincible, his eyes fixed on his Lord. But then doubt had crept in. The voice had returned, "You're sinking. You can't do this." And indeed he had sunk, overcome by fear. Jesus had saved him that day, lifting him from the water, but the memory of his failure lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't let him go. Tonight, that same voice was louder than ever, and Peter could feel it gnawing at his heart. The fire in front of him crackled softly, but it did little to warm the coldness he felt inside. Peter, the one often considered the leader of the disciples, finally broke the silence. His voice was low, almost fragile, betraying the strength he had tried to portray for so long. "Master," Peter said, his eyes fixed on the ground, I feel like I'm failing you. There's this voice inside of me, always telling me that I'm not worthy to follow you. That no matter how hard I try, I'm going to disappoint you again." The words hung in the air, and for a moment no one spoke. The disciples had always seen Peter as the strongest among them, the most confident, the one who never hesitated to speak his mind or act. But tonight they saw him differently, vulnerable, human just like them. Thomas, who had often been labeled the doubter, nodded silently. He understood all too well what Peter was talking about. The voice of doubt had been his constant companion, whispering in his ear at every turn. He had questioned Jesus before, and the weight of that doubt still clung to him like a heavy cloak. "I feel it too," Thomas finally said, breaking his silence. "I try to believe, but there's always this part of me that wonders, what if it's not true? What if I'm not really worthy to witness these miracles? Sometimes, I doubt myself even more than I doubt what I see with my own eyes." Matthew shifted uncomfortably, his past as a tax collector still a fresh wound in his heart. Though he had walked away from that life, the shame lingered. "I thought leaving my old life behind would free me," he said quietly, but the voice is still there. "It reminds me of my past mistakes, makes me feel like I can never truly escape who I was. I hear it even when I try to do good." The other disciples nodded in agreement, each one recognizing the same struggle. The voice of doubt had many forms: fear, shame, insecurity, but its grip on them was the same. They had seen the power of Jesus firsthand, but their own inner voices seemed stronger, dragging them down into darkness even when they wanted to walk in the light. As the disciples spoke, pouring out their hearts, Jesus sat quietly, his gaze moving from one to the next. He listened, his heart full of love and compassion for them. He had known their struggles even before they spoke, for he understood the human heart like no other. Yet, he allowed them to speak, to share their burdens aloud, for he knew that sometimes healing begins with confession. Finally, when the air was thick with emotion and the disciples had shared their deepest fears, Jesus spoke. "My beloved friends," he began, his voice gentle and full of warmth, "the battles you face within your own minds are not unlike the battles that every soul must endure. But let me tell you something that will bring you comfort." He looked around at them, his eyes filled with deep compassion, before he continued. "There was once a man, much like all of you, named Jonah." Jesus began, the tone of his voice soft but filled with authority. The disciples leaned in, sensing the wisdom that would follow. Jonah was loved by many, yet he struggled with something unseen. Each day, he faced a battle in his mind between two voices. Jonah, like many of us, had an inner voice that would constantly remind him of his inadequacies. Every time he attempted something good, this voice would speak louder. "You're not enough. You will fail. You aren't worthy of love." Jonah wanted to ignore it, but the more he tried, the louder it became. Eventually, he began to believe it. He withdrew from the people who cared about him, stopped helping others, and spent more and more time alone with his thoughts. The more isolated he became, the more the voice of doubt consumed him. The disciples listened intently, each one recognizing a part of themselves in Jonah's story. One day, as Jonah sat by the river, he saw an elderly woman struggling to carry a heavy load. Jonah's heart longed to help her, but as he stood, the voice of doubt returned. "You're too weak. What if you drop the basket? You'll only make things worse." Jonah hesitated, paralyzed by fear. But then another voice, quieter and softer, spoke within him. This voice said, "You are kind. You have the strength to help. You are capable." Jesus paused, his eyes scanning the faces of the disciples, ensuring the lesson was sinking in. Jonah, at first unsure of which voice to believe, made a choice that day. He decided to listen to the quieter voice, the one that called him to kindness and strength. He approached the woman, took the basket from her, and carried it to her home. Along the way, the woman smiled at him, and in that smile, Jonah realized something. The voice of doubt was a lie. He was enough. He was capable. The disciples sat in silence, letting the story wash over them. The fire crackled softly, and for a moment, it seemed as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for Jesus to continue. As Jesus paused, the story seemed to resonate deeply within each of them, and the emotion in the circle grew heavier. Peter, overwhelmed by the story's truth, could no longer contain himself. His voice, though steady, quivered with emotion. "But Master," Peter said, his eyes filling with tears, "how do we continue to hear the quieter voice when the voice of doubt is so loud? Feels like I'm drowning in it. Even when I want to believe in the good, the bad seems to scream louder. I don't know how to silence it." Jesus turned to Peter, his expression filled with warmth and understanding. "Peter," he said softly, "you do not need to silence the voice of doubt completely. The voice may never disappear, but you can learn to speak louder than it with the truth. Each time that voice tells you that you are not enough, remember this: you are loved beyond measure. You are chosen. You are strong." Peter's eyes brimmed with tears as he took in the words, the emotional weight of the moment settling deep within him. "But how can we believe that when we've failed so many times?" Thomas asked, his own heart heavy with the doubts that had plagued him for years. "I have questioned you, doubted you. How can I trust myself when I've fallen so often?" Jesus turned his gaze to Thomas, his eyes filled with love. "Thomas," he said gently, "your doubts do not make you unworthy. They make you human. It is in our moments of doubt that we grow, that we learn to lean not on our own understanding but on the truth that lies within. Even in your doubt, you are loved. Even in your questions, you are never abandoned." Tears welled up in Thomas's eyes as he felt the warmth of Jesus' words wrap around his heart like a comforting embrace. The doubts that had once consumed him now felt less like chains and more like stepping stones to a deeper faith. The fire crackled softly as the disciples absorbed the words of their master. Jesus had not promised that the voice of doubt would disappear, but rather that they had the power to choose which voice to believe. It was a truth so simple yet so profound, and it stirred something deep within each of them. Jesus stood slowly, his robes brushing the soft earth as he moved closer to the fire. He gestured toward the flames, and as the disciples watched, the fire danced and flickered in the night. "This fire," Jesus said, "represents the truth within you. The truth that you are loved, chosen, and strong. But like any fire, it needs tending. If you neglect it, if you stop feeding it with love and truth, it will die down, and the coldness of doubt will creep in. Jesus knelt beside the fire and added more wood to it, the flames instantly growing brighter, warmer. You must keep feeding the fire with the voice of love, he said. Speak truth over yourself. Remind yourself daily of who you are, not who the voice of doubt says you are. As Jesus stood, the disciples felt the warmth of the fire grow, not just from the flames but from the words he spoke. It was as if their hearts were being rekindled, and the weight of their doubts was being lifted little by little. You are not alone in this, Jesus said, his voice soft but filled with authority. I am with you, always. And when the voice of doubt feels too loud, when the storm inside feels too strong, remember that you have the power to speak truth over yourself. You have the power to choose the voice of love, the voice of God. The disciples felt a surge of emotion rise within them, joy, peace, and a deep sense of belonging. Tears streamed down their faces, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming love and peace they now felt. The weight of their doubts, their insecurities, and their fears had been replaced with the truth of who they were. Peter looked at Jesus, his heart full of gratitude. Master, he whispered, thank you. Jesus smiled at him, a smile filled with warmth and understanding. You are stronger than you know, Peter. All of you are. And you are never alone. The fire crackled once more, its light reflecting in the tear-streaked faces of the disciples. The night was growing darker, but in their hearts, a new light had been kindled, a light of love, of truth, and of peace. The voice of doubt may never disappear, but you have the power to choose which voice to listen to. Feed the fire of truth within you, and the voice of love will grow stronger. And remember, you are never alone in your journey, for the love of God is with you, always. This is end of the story. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.